In the valley of dust and silence, two lives crossed. One, a cowboy haunted by loss, the other, an Apache widow standing alone against the world. What began as mistrust beneath a storm would become a story of survival, sacrifice, and a love neither expected. The valley lay bare beneath a sky of iron. Wind dragged thin veils of snow across the ground, scratching at the frozen earth like a restless hand. A lone rider came down from the ridge, horse ribs showing through its dull hide, breath steaming in ragged plumes. The man in the saddle sat straight though the years bent his bones inside. His hat brim sloped low, cutting the sting of wind from his eyes. But his face was gray with travel, his jaw set with the silence of a man who had spoken too little for too long. The trail wound between stunted cottonwoods and led him toward a cabin, the only mark of settlement in the valley. Smoke rose thin from its chimney, uncertain in the storm, a wavering thread against the bruised horizon. The rider tightened his reins and the horse answered with a weary groan. Shelter meant survival, but shelter did not come without cost. He knew it, and the valley seemed to know it too. The homestead bore the scars of endurance. Its roof sagged slightly under snow, boards patched with mismatched planks, fences leaning as though tired of standing. Yet there was order in the neglect. A stack of chopped wood stood neat against the wall. A red shawl hung from a peg near the door, its fringe stirring in the wind, a sign of life within. She stepped out before he reached the porch, rifle balanced against her shoulder. The woman was tall and still, her dark hair drawn into a single braid bound with a ribbon faded to ash gray. Her eyes did not blink against the snow, though the cold cut deep. She wore no expression, only the quiet strength of one who had learned that silence could be sharper than any word. The cowboy drew his horse to a halt and tipped his hat. "Evenin', ma'am," he said, though evening had not yet come. His voice was low, cracked by dust and distance. Her gaze flicked from him to the horse, then back again. She did not lower the rifle. "You lost?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only looking for shelter. Storm's near." For a long moment the wind answered in her place. Then slowly she angled the rifle down, though not away. "You'll tie your horse at the post. Water's in the trough. Don't expect more than a roof." He dismounted, his boots sinking into the crust of snow. The horse nudged his shoulder, weary, and he patted its neck before leading it to the post. Only when the saddle was set aside and the reins secure did he step toward the porch. She had already moved inside, leaving the door open behind her, a half-offer, half-challenge. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old pine resin. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its light reaching across a room that was small but ordered. Tools hung on the wall, saws, hammers, a scythe, each polished by use but long untouched. A rocking chair faced the fire, its seat worn smooth by another's weight. The absence of that weight filled the air like a shadow. She placed the rifle against the wall near the chair and drew her shawl around her shoulders. "You can sit by the fire. Don't touch what ain't yours." He nodded once and lowered himself to the hearth, stretching his hands to the flames. His fingers were scarred, the nails cracked, and the heat made them ache as if in remembrance. He closed his eyes a moment, listening to the hiss of snow against the window, the low moan of wind around the cabin's seams. Her movements were careful, deliberate. She set a kettle on the iron hook above the fire, the handle squeaking. She did not look at him as she worked. Her braid swung against her back, catching the firelight, the ribbon at its end frayed and thin. "You ride far?" she asked at last. "Far enough." "You'll leave when the sky clears." "I will." That was the end of it. She took the rocking chair, settling with her shawl pulled tight, her body swaying forward and back in a rhythm older than speech. The creak of wood filled the silence between them. He watched the fire, not her, but he felt the weight of her eyes studying him from time to time, as though measuring how much space he might take, how much risk he might bring. The kettle began to sing. She poured water into 2 tin cups, dark coffee rising with its bitter steam. One cup she set on the hearth near him, though she did not offer it with words. He lifted it, nodded, and drank. It was strong and harsh, but it carried warmth into his chest. "Much obliged," he said. She did not answer, only rocked. The cowboy studied the walls, lined with reminders of another man. A pair of boots beneath the bed. A coat, patched at the elbows, hanging from a peg. Tools sharpened but idle, a man's world left standing but empty. He felt the air of abandonment in every board, every shadow. Her eyes followed his gaze, and she drew her shawl tighter, as though bracing against a question he had not asked. "He's gone," she said at last, her voice even. "2 winters now." The cowboy inclined his head. "I'm sorry. Don't be." She rocked once more, the chair creaking. "Sorry won't feed the chickens or mend the roof." Silence folded in again, but it was different now. Less of a blade, more of a weight shared. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the shutters. Snow pressed hard against the door. The cowboy drank the last of the coffee and set the cup aside. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes on the fire. The flames licked upward, casting long shadows that climbed the walls like restless spirits. He did not tell her his own story, that a woman once waited for him on the plains, that her wedding dress lay folded in a trunk, untouched, buried with her. He did not speak of graves or long rides across dust. Such words belonged to the fire and the dark, not to strangers. Instead, he said, "Storm'll be worse by nightfall." She nodded.
"So you'll stay till morning." The rocking slowed.
She stared into the fire, her braid resting against her shoulder. The rifle leaned nearby, the shawl cloaked her thin frame, and the creak of the chair kept time with the wind. They were strangers bound by mistrust and silence. Yet under the same roof, watching the same fire, surviving the same storm. It was not welcome, not yet, but it was a beginning. The storm did not break clean. It lingered in gray mornings and brittle winds that bent the cottonwoods, in nights where snow hissed against the windows like whispers too faint to understand. The cowboy rose early, his boots crunching on frozen ground, and set to work without asking. He mended the sagging fence, replaced broken rails with timber dragged down from the ridge, and split wood until his palms were raw. His breath hung white in the cold air, and the steady crack of the axe was the only sound that challenged the silence of the valley. She watched from the doorway, shawl pulled across her shoulders. Sometimes her hands rested on the rifle, sometimes on the frame of the door, but her eyes never left him. She did not offer thanks, nor did she tell him to stop. Yet when he turned, he always found her watching, her braid swaying in the wind, the ribbon at its end snapping like a flag of weary defiance. Inside the cabin, the past clung as stubbornly as the smoke in the rafters. At night, the rocking chair creaked of its own accord, swaying when no hand touched it, as though memory alone could set it in motion. Tools leaned in corners, polished by the years of a man now gone. An old cradle gathered dust in the shadows, its wood dry and cracked, a vessel that had never been filled. The cowboy's eyes lingered on these things, but he asked no questions. He carried his own ghosts and did not invite hers. She remembered them all the same. Her people had turned their backs when she chose the white settler, calling her traitor. The settlers never welcomed her fully either, their gazes cutting like knives, their women clutching children closer. When her husband was alive, she could endure it, for he was a shield of sorts. But death stripped her bare. Widowhood made her an outcast twice over, belonging to neither world. The homestead was not only her shelter, it was her exile. The cowboy carried his own silence, but sometimes, while splitting logs or leading her horse to water, the shadows of his grief crossed his face. He remembered the curve of a hill where he had laid his wife to rest, the wedding dress folded away and never touched again. In his saddlebags, beneath worn blankets and spare cartridges, there was a photograph faded by sun and dust. He never took it out. The weight of it was enough. Their days were bound in routine. He worked, she watched. In the evenings, they shared the fire, her rocking chair creaking, his hands folded on his knees. Sometimes she braided her hair again, loosening the strands before weaving them tight. Sometimes he sharpened his knife, the scrape of steel against stone echoing in the quiet. Words were few, but the air between them was no longer filled with mistrust alone. It was heavy with the unsaid, yet softened by the presence of another breath, another shadow moving across the floorboards. One morning, after he returned from mending a fence post half buried in snow, she placed a tin cup on the table before him. Steam rose from the black coffee, curling like smoke. She did not speak, only turned back to the fire. He lifted the cup, nodded once, and drank. The bitterness filled his mouth, the warmth spread through his chest, and for the first time he felt something more than the ache of labor or the bite of cold. The next morning, the cup was waiting again. He began to answer her with nods, then with a word or two. She noticed the change but did not press it. When she passed him bread with his coffee, he said, "Thank you." When he brought in wood to stack by the hearth, she said, "Good," her voice almost tender, though the word itself was plain. At night, when the wind rattled the shutters, he lay awake on the floor near the hearth, listening to the chair creak as she rocked in the dark. He wondered what she thought of in those hours, if she remembered her husband's voice or her people's rejection, or if she sat simply to keep the silence from swallowing her whole. He never asked. The asking would have been too sharp too soon, yet the bond grew like embers glowing beneath ash, not bright, not sudden, but steady. She began to leave small signs of allowance, bread left near his place, water drawn before he asked, the rifle leaning a little farther from her chair when he was near. He, in turn, left signs of his own. A patch mended on her chicken coop, tools sharpened without request, a horse brushed until its coat shone faint in the weak sunlight. They were not yet companions. Not yet even friends, but their silences began to fold together instead of standing apart. When the wind howled at night, it did not feel as cold inside the cabin. When the valley groaned under frost, the weight of labor felt less sharp when divided between two. Still, the shadows did not leave. The rocking chair creaked, and she would sometimes reach across her chest to touch the faded ribbon at the end of her braid, as though to remind herself of something she had lost or refused to let go. He would stare at the fire too long, seeing in its flames the shape of a woman gone and a life buried beneath earth and memory. But morning always came, and with it, the coffee waiting on the table. He always drank it, and she always poured it, and between the steam rising and the silence shared, something unspoken began to take root. It was not warmth yet. It was not trust yet, but it was survival. And in survival there was the first fragile thread of belonging. The sky darkened long before the day was spent. Heavy clouds rolled down from the north, bruised purple at the edges, swollen with rain. The valley carried a stillness that was not peace but warning, as if the earth itself held its breath. The cowboy tightened the cinch on the horse after its feed, eyes lifting often to the ridgeline. He had known skies like this before, skies that promised more than rain. By noon, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. 4 riders came over the rise, shadows against the darkening sky. Their coats flapped loose, guns hanging low at their sides, faces hollowed by hunger and road dust. The cowboy stood near the fence line, hat low, his hands empty but not unready. The leader grinned as they approached, a grin without warmth. "Well, now, if it ain't an old friend," he said, voice carrying across the brittle air. His eyes swept to the cabin where the woman had stepped into the doorway, shawl wrapped close, rifle balanced in her arms. "And you've got yourself company. Apache, no less. Man always did keep strange bedfellows." The cowboy's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. Another rider spat into the snow, laughing. "Wonder how she got herself a place like this. Ain't right woman like that keepin' land while men starve." His tone was oily, sharp with cruelty. The woman lifted the rifle a little higher, her dark eyes steady. "You'll move on," she said. Her voice did not tremble. The riders chuckled among themselves, circling like dogs scenting weakness. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, staring hard at the cowboy. "You know how it works. A man pays his dues. You owe us after the trail." The cowboy's voice was quiet even. "I don't owe you." "Every man owes," the leader replied, spurs jingling as he shifted. His grin turned mean. "Maybe we'll collect from her instead." The rifle rose to her shoulder then, straight and sure. The firelight from the cabin caught along the steel. "Try it," she said low. The air thickened between them, silence heavy as the storm clouds above. Then the leader spat, scowled, and tugged his reins. "Storm's comin'. We'll be back when it clears." He turned, and the others followed, laughter trailing behind them like smoke, their shapes blurred into the gathering dusk, swallowed by the ridgeline. The cowboy exhaled slowly, but he did not look at her. She remained in the doorway, rifle steady, until the last echo of hooves was gone. Only then did she lower it, the shawl falling loose around her shoulders. That night the storm broke. Rain lashed against the cabin, hammering the roof until the beams groaned. The wind tore at the shutters, forcing its way through every crack, rattling the boards like bones. Thunder rolled over the valley, deep and relentless. A voice older than men. The cowboy sat by the door, revolver across his knees. His hat hung from a peg, hair damp from the leaks that dripped down the walls. His eyes were fixed on the black window, watching for shapes that might rise against the storm. She sat by the fire, braiding her hair tight, fingers swift and certain. Each braid pulled her face into sharper lines as though strength were woven strand by strand. The ribbon at the end was tied firmer than before, no longer a symbol of mourning but of defiance. Her lips moved in a whisper too soft to catch, words carried in her mother's tongue, prayers or curses or both. The cabin creaked, the rocking chair swaying though she did not sit in it. The kettle on the hearth hissed, water spilling over with each shudder of thunder. Shadows leapt across the walls, making tools look like specters, handles like limbs. For long hours they held their posts, he at the door, hand on iron, she by the fire, hands on her braid. Their silence was not the old silence of strangers, but a silence drawn together against the dark. Once, lightning split the sky, filling the room with a blinding flash. For an instant they saw each other fully, his scarred hand steady, her dark eyes fierce. And then the world was black again. Neither looked away. Outside, the storm raged as though it would tear the valley apart. The riders might have found shelter in some hollow, or they might have been riding still. The cowboy did not know, but he expected them. Men like that always came back. When the fire dropped low, he stood and placed another log on it. Sparks leapt, showering upward like stars. She watched him, her braid finished, the ribbon tied. She did not thank him for the fire or for his watch at the door, but her gaze lingered a heartbeat longer before she turned back to the flames. At last, near dawn, the storm eased. The rain slowed to a steady patter, the wind fell to a low moan. The cabin settled as if sighing with relief. The cowboy holstered his revolver, but he did not move from the door. She loosened her shawl, shoulders relaxing, yet her rifle still rested within reach. They had not spoken in hours, yet something had shifted. Protection had been shared, not demanded. Trust had been born not from kindness, but from the knowledge that both had stood the night together, unyielding, waiting for whatever might come. The firelight softened, painting their faces with weary glow. In that light, the cabin no longer seemed only haunted. It seemed for the first time defended. The storm passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the thunder had been. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, forming small rivulets that traced the earth into mud. The sky cleared in tatters, thin streaks of pale blue breaking through the gray. But inside the cabin, the air remained thick with all that had been unspoken. The cowboy sat near the hearth, a whetstone in one hand, the long knife in the other. The sound of steel against stone scraped rhythm into the quiet, harsh but steady. Each stroke cast sparks of memory across his mind. Nights on other frontiers, other roofs, waiting for men to come. His hands were practiced, scarred knuckles bending without thought. And yet there was a weariness in his posture, a slump of shoulders that no sharpening could cut away. She sat opposite him, shawl loose about her shoulders, a shirt of his stretched across her lap. The fabric had torn along the seam, a wound left by work. Her needle flashed in and out, thread pulling taut, the small gesture of repair both careful and reluctant. She did not look at him often, but when she did, her gaze lingered. It was the kind of glance that saw more than it admitted, the kind that measured scars and silence alike. The fire cracked between them, flames snapping as though restless to fill the stillness. Outside, the wind had quieted, leaving only the slow drip of rain and the distant call of a lone bird daring to sing again. For many nights they had spoken little, their words rationed like winter grain. But this night, when the mending was nearly done and his knife gleamed sharp enough to catch firelight, she set the shirt aside and rested her hands on her lap. "My people cast me out," she said, voice low, almost flat. "They said I betrayed blood when I married him." Her gaze fixed on the flames, not on him. "The settlers never let me forget what I was either. To them I was never wife, only Indian." The cowboy stilled his hand on the knife. He did not interrupt. "When he died, there was no one left," she continued, her voice tightening. "The chickens still needed feeding. Wolves came for the sheep. Winter came for me. I fought them all. But every night the house was empty, and every morning it was empty still." Her eyes softened then, though they glistened with something unshed. Loneliness cuts sharper than hunger, sharper than cold. The knife lowered to his knee, his scarred hands folded together, fingers interlaced as though in prayer. He listened, the weight of her words pressing against the hollows in his chest. He knew the shape of loneliness, how it hollowed a man until even his own voice sounded foreign to him. But hearing it in her tongue, wrapped in her sorrow, made it something larger than his own grief. He did not answer, not with words. His silence was not rejection but respect, a space for her truth to settle without being measured against his. She seemed to understand, for she turned back to the fire, her rocking chair creaking once as she leaned into it. The rhythm of her motion filled the cabin until it was almost a lullaby. Later, long after the fire had sunk to coals, he stepped outside onto the porch. Rain still fell in light threads, dripping from the brim of his hat. The valley was dark, hills rising like crouched beasts against the sky. The scent of wet earth filled the air, mingling with pine and smoke. She followed him, shawl drawn close, her braid damp from the storm's mist. She stood beside him without a word, her presence soft yet unyielding. The silence stretched until it was nearly unbearable. Then she spoke, her voice just above a whisper, trembling not with fear but with dignity and sorrow. "Stay with me and I'll give you what no white woman ever could." The words hung between them, heavier than the storm. Her eyes were steady, though her hands clutched the shawl as if it were her last defense. She was not pleading for possession, nor offering herself as bargain. She was offering a kind of survival, a joining against the emptiness that had marked them both. He did not turn to her. His gaze remained fixed on the hills, jaw tight, breath slow. The rain dripped from his hat brim, tracing down his coat. The silence after her words was long, longer than any she had given him before. At last he drew in a breath, deep and steady, but no answer came. He remained as stone, staring into the darkness beyond. His silence was not cruel, but neither was it accepting. It was the silence of a man caught between past and present, unable yet to step fully into either. She did not press him. She stood beside him, her braid brushing her shoulder, her shawl damp with rain. After a time, she turned back into the cabin, leaving him alone on the porch. The night closed around him, heavy with the scent of storm and earth. He stood long in that place, his heart pulled taut between what had been buried and what might yet be. Inside, the coals glowed faint, a promise of warmth waiting should he choose to claim it. The days grew longer, the sun staying in the sky a little more with each morning. Snow melted in uneven patches, leaving dark earth beneath, and the valley breathed again after its long stillness. With the thaw came work, mending, tending, building, and in the rhythm of that work, the space between them began to change. He showed her how to repair the old saddle left hanging in the lean-to. His hands moved with the confidence of habit, guiding the awl through cracked leather, stitching as he explained. She listened, her brow furrowed, then tried her hand at the work, fingers slower but careful. He corrected her grip once, their hands brushing, rough skin against warm. Neither spoke of it, but neither pulled away too quickly. In return, she taught him the braiding her mother had shown her as a child, 3 strands woven into one, a symbol of strength, of unity. They sat by the fire, her shawl draped across her shoulders, his hat resting on the floor. She handed him strips of cloth, showing him the pattern, patient even when his thick fingers fumbled. He muttered at his mistakes, and she allowed herself a quiet smile. The braid, once finished, was tied with her ribbon and laid upon the table like a promise. The fire was constant, at dawn when coffee boiled in the blackened pot, at night when flames threw long shadows against the cabin walls. It warmed their hands, their silence, their slow and careful companionship. He began to look for her eyes when he spoke. She began to let her gaze linger when he worked. What once had been only survival now carried something unspoken, a heat not of passion but of presence. But warmth never lived long without test. The riders returned as the valley softened into spring. Their horses came down the ridge at dusk, hooves heavy on thawing earth. The same 4, faces harder now, eyes sharper with hunger and cruelty. The leader rode forward, spitting into the dirt. "You've had time," he called. "We've had patience. Now we'll take our share." His gaze slid to the woman standing in the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, rifle near at hand. His grin widened. "Or we'll take you." She raised the rifle steady, but her hands trembled faintly beneath the cloth. The cowboy stepped forward before she could speak, placing himself between her and the riders. His revolver rested in his hand, held loose but certain. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "You'll leave," the leader laughed, sharp as breaking glass. "We'll leave, sure enough, but not before we've taken what's owed." The air tensed, thick with the smell of mud and horses. The woman's breath caught behind him. He stood still as stone, hat brim low, revolver angled toward the ground but ready to rise. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the butt of his pistol. The cowboy's revolver lifted in answer, smooth as the draw of breath. Silence stretched thin as wire. Then the first shot cracked. Thunder without rain roared through the valley. Horses reared, men shouted. The woman's rifle barked from behind him, smoke curling into the dusk. The cowboy fired again, the report echoing against the hills. Dust rose in frantic clouds, men cursing, bullets sparking off stone and wood. It was over as quickly as it began. 2 riders lay in the dirt, blood soaking into the thawing ground. The others fled, their shapes swallowed by the ridge, curses trailing after them like smoke. Silence followed, broken only by the harsh breathing of horse and man alike. The cowboy lowered his revolver, but blood dripped from his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. His knees bent slightly, weight shifting as though the earth tilted beneath him. She rushed to him, rifle clattering against the porch. Her hands caught his arm, pulling him toward the cabin. "Sit," she ordered, voice steady though her eyes burned. He obeyed, lowering himself into the chair near the fire. The lantern was lit, its glow soft but unwavering. She fetched water, cloth, needle, thread. Her hands were sure as she cleaned the wound, wiping away blood, pressing hard until the flow slowed. He winced once but did not speak, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above. Her breath was steady, each exhale like prayer. She stitched the wound with careful precision, the thread pulling his skin together. The firelight flickered against her face, revealing not only resolve but the faint tremor of fear beneath. She had stood against wolves, storms, and hunger, but the thought of losing him now struck deeper than any threat yet faced. When it was done, she bound the arm with cloth and sat back, her hands shaking for the first time. The cowboy looked at her then, truly looked, his eyes softened by pain but sharpened by something more. "My wife," he said quietly, voice rough as gravel, "was buried on the plains, years back. I left her dress folded in a trunk and I've not opened it since. Couldn't bear to. Thought if I kept riding, kept working, I might outpace the hole it left." His breath caught and he closed his eyes. But a man don't outpace sorrow. He carries it, same as his own shadow. She listened, hands folded in her lap, her braid resting against her shoulder. Her eyes glistened, though she did not weep. His confession was not asked for, but it was given, and in the giving something between them shifted again. The fire crackled, throwing sparks that leapt like fleeting stars. She reached out, laid her hand on his uninjured arm. Not a claim, not a demand, only a touch that said she had heard, and that the shadow he carried was no longer his alone. The valley held its breath in the aftermath. The riders did not return. Their absence was louder than their threats had ever been. The air felt emptied of menace, as though the storm had carried them away for good. What remained was silence, the kind that comes after battle, after blood, after fire. The cowboy spent the following days moving slower, his wound stiff beneath its bandages. She worked beside him, not as nurse alone, but as partner. She carried water, he stacked what wood he could. They shared meals without words, glances across the table saying enough. The land, scarred by hooves and bullets, seemed to soften again. Snow fell late that spring, light as ash drifting from the sky. It lay on the earth without bite, melting almost as soon as it touched. Yet it carried a strange peace, as though the world was being forgiven for all it had endured. One morning he saddled his horse. His movements were deliberate, as though each strap, each buckle carried weight beyond leather and iron. The saddlebags were packed, meager though they were. The rifle rested in its scabbard, worn but ready. His hat sat low over his brow. She stood in the doorway, shawl pulled close, braid trailing over her shoulder. She did not ask where he was going. She did not beg him to stay. The air between them was too thick with things left unsaid, and both knew the leaving had been in him since the day he arrived. "You'll be riding at first light?" she asked quietly. He nodded, hand tightening on the saddle horn. "Best to move on before the trail gets soft." She lowered her gaze, shawl clutched tighter. The rocking chair creaked faintly behind her, moved by some current of air. It sounded like memory sighing. That night they shared the fire one last time. He sharpened his knife, though it was already sharp. She mended a torn hem that did not truly need mending. Their silence was not empty but full, of what had been spoken and what had not. When dawn came, pale light stretched across the valley. The snow still fell, soft and steady, vanishing as it touched the warming ground. He mounted his horse, reins in hand, and turned toward the open land. She stood on the porch, shawl wrapped close, face unreadable in the gray light. He rode slow at first, each hoofstep heavy in the damp earth. The distance between them stretched, 10 paces, 20, 50. His shoulders tightened beneath his coat, his breath heavy in his chest. With each step, the weight of leaving pressed harder. At the edge of her land, he stopped. The hills rose ahead, dark against the pale sky. The road stretched on, the same endless road he had ridden for years. His hand gripped the reins, knuckles white. He turned. She was still there, standing on the porch. The rocking chair creaked faintly behind her. Her braid hung down her back, ribbon frayed, a line of strength and sorrow bound into one. The shawl hugged her frame, but her posture was straight, unbroken. She was not calling him back, not offering plea or bargain. She was simply there, present, alive, unyielding. The sight caught him like a hand to the chest. For years he had carried his wife's memory like a stone, a weight that had bent him low but never broken him. He had ridden from place to place, never stopping, never daring to set down roots. To do so would have felt like betrayal. But in that moment, watching the woman on the porch, he understood. To keep riding was to keep himself buried beside a grave that no longer needed his vigil. He pulled the reins, turning the horse back toward the cabin. She did not move as he approached. Her eyes followed him, but her body remained still, shawl clutched close. Only when he dismounted and set his hat in his hand did her breath release in a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. He stepped onto the porch, boots leaving prints in the thin snow. For a moment they stood close but apart, the silence between them heavier than words. Then he spoke, voice low, steady. "I've been riding too long with ghosts," he said. "Don't reckon I'll find peace out there. But maybe—" His gaze held hers, unflinching. "Maybe I might find it here." Her eyes softened, though no tears fell. She reached for the braid at her shoulder, fingers brushing the frayed ribbon. Slowly she nodded. Not agreement alone, but acceptance. Of him, of herself, of the life that had scarred them both yet left them standing still. The rocking chair creaked again, but this time it did not sound like absence. It sounded like welcome. The days that followed were quiet but no longer heavy. He repaired the barn roof. She planted early crops in the thawing earth. They shared the fire each night, not as strangers bound by storm, but as two souls who had chosen to stay when they could have left. The homestead, once haunted, grew warm again. The cradle remained empty. The tools still bore the memory of another man's hand, but the shadows no longer ruled the space. Together they filled it, with work, with silence, with the faint beginning of something that might one day be called love. Not savior and saved. Not bargain and debt, but man and woman, both scarred, both weary, both given a second chance. Snow fell again that week, soft as forgiveness, vanishing into the warming earth, and in its quiet descent the valley seemed to breathe easier, as if it too had been waiting for them to find one another.